Good day and welcome to the Population Reference Bureau Counting Women's Work, Time Use, Policy and Economic Growth Conference Call. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Gretchen Donehower. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, and thank you for joining us. I'm Gretchen Donehower. I'm a demographer at UC Berkeley and the principal investigator of the Counting Women's Work project, and I'm honored to be one of your moderators today. We're hoping to have a conversation today about measuring all of the work we do, including paid work and the unpaid care work that is traditionally considered women's work. I'm doing air quotes here, but you can't see them. We want to focus closely on using those measurements to create better policies and better outcomes. And the current pandemic crisis has shown us the importance of unpaid care work and how vital that is to maintaining standards of living and coping with adversity. And so it's a good time to be bringing light to these issues. I'm going to be talking briefly about the project in general, and then follow that with 3 short presentations from my colleagues who've been involved in the project for years. From South Africa, we'll have Morne Oosthuizen of the University of Cape Town. From Senegal, Professor Latif Dramani of the University of Thiès. And from Colombia, Professor Piedad Urdinola of the National University of Colombia in Bogota. After we hear from the researchers who've been involved in the project, we'll switch gears and hear from Dr. Juan Oviedo, the Chief Statistician of the National Statistical Office in Colombia. He'll be able to give us a perspective of someone involved in both gathering primary data and serving data users from the public and government who are interested in gender data and time-use data. So if I can begin by motivating the Counting Women's Work with 2 charts. Here's the first one. The first one shows what we usually talk about when we talk about work in policy, government, and economic circles. What you see here is a chart that shows along the bottom for each age, the height of the orange area shows how many hours per week people spend on average in paid work. So this includes formal, informal sector, self-employment, salary work. And the shade comes from averaging over the experience of 17 different countries in the Counting Women's Work project. We get the estimates for each country from a time use survey that asks respondents how much time they were spending on different activities. It's cut off at age 15 because younger than that, most surveys don't ask for participants' time use. So this is what we usually mean when we talk about work. However, those of us in this room know that there's a lot more work that counts, and Counting Women's Work wants to count that work. Our time use surveys allow us to also observe how much additional time is spent in unpaid care work activities that on this chart are shown in blue. In the darker blue is direct care activities, so that's caring directly for children, elders, the sick and disabled. And of course, this is from before the COVID period, so many of us are doing a lot more of this work with our kids home from school or potentially dealing with a sick family member in the household. And then in the lighter blue at the top is a type of unpaid care work called household services or indirect unpaid care work. This is the general cooking, cleaning, maintenance, and management activities, that keep households running. This type of work is often ignored in discussions on policy and society, but it's very important, and as you can see in this chart, it takes up a great deal of time. So during the peak working ages, direct care and household services almost double the total work time compared to just the paid work area in orange. At the oldest ages, it's quite a bit more than the area in orange of paid work. At younger ages, we can compare it with another vital activity that the young are undertaking, which is the education time, and that's shown in gray. Young people are spending a lot of time on education, but also on unpaid care work. For some analyses, we will change this time value chart to value in monetary terms by estimating a market wage for household services and direct care activities. For other analyses in the project, we'll look at who consumes this time and how this time is transferred from the person doing the care to the person receiving the care. And so we refer to the whole system as the national time transfer accounts. So the focus on time reminds us that we all have only 24 hours a day. And these activities compete. So these work activities compete also with time for leisure and self-care. And it's a matter for Counting Women's Work research to show us how that competition plays out and sort of which activities win. And it's a matter for policy to decide if we want to keep it that way. So with that general introduction, I'd like to now turn over to my colleagues who will provide the specifics, the differences that hide within this broad average across countries, across people, and invite our first speaker, Morne Oosthuizen, to describe the experience from South Africa.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to talk about the gender gaps that we observe in countries around the world in terms of how people spend their time. But I will be using South African data, but many of the broad patterns that we see in South Africa are typical cross-country patterns. Overall, in South Africa, we estimate that the average person aged 10 years or older spends around 20 hours per week in market work, and a similar amount in care work, and then around 6.5 hours per week in learning activities, and around 65 hours a week sleeping. One of the things that is clear from our analysis of the time use data is that there are significant differences in time use across. This is something that we saw in the figure that Gretchen showed us, whether we're talking about market work, care work, or education. Children are spending more time in education and so-called non-productive activities such as self-care, including sleeping and leisure. Adults are spending relatively more time in productive activities, including market and care work. So we also know that there are substantial variations in time use by gender. And as part of the Counting Women's Work research, we analyzed how much time people are spending in various productive and non-productive activities by age and then also by gender. And we can generate graphs that look something like this. So this is taking the graph that Gretchen showed, but disaggregating by gender. So this figure is really showing us how much time in hours per week the average person spends in a given activity, depending on their age and their gender. The South African data shows the same broad patterns that we see in countries around the world. So if we look first at market work, time allocations are at their highest during the prime working ages for men and for women. In South Africa, individuals between the ages of 30 and 49 years account for about half or just over half of the total time allocated to market work, even if they represent only 1/4 of the population. Time spent in care work tends to be more evenly distributed over the life cycle, and it's only really the very young and the very old where time allocation to care is much lower. So we see, for example, roughly 1/3 of time spent in care is accounted for by the cohort between the ages of 18 and 29 years, and another 1/3 is accounted by the 30 to 49-year-old cohort. At the same time, the two groups at the extreme, so children aged 10 to 17 years and adults aged 60 years and above, both produce relatively large amounts of care relative to their shares of the population. One of the things that we also see in terms of care work is this double peak, where care responsibilities are particularly pressing for women in their mid-20s and mid-30s, and peak again early in their 60s. We see a similar pattern for men, but it's timed a little bit differently, so a little bit younger for young men and a little bit older for older men. And this double peak we see really when people are when they're dealing with young kids, but then also as grandparents when they are becoming more involved again in terms of care. We also see that education is particularly important in terms of time use for young people. And so in South Africa, for this 10 to 17-year-old cohort, learning activities consume between 21 and 24 hours per week on average, but it drops off very steeply as participation rates fall for older cohorts. Clearly, though, from these figures, we can see that men spend significantly longer hours than women in market work, while women spend significantly longer hours than men in care work. So these very clear differences between men and women in the way shows how the two genders specialize in terms of their time allocations. Men are specializing in market work. So in total, across the entire population, aged 10 years and older, for every 1 hour spent in market work by women, men spend 2 hours. So roughly 2/3 of the time in market work is accounted for by men. Women are specialized even more strongly in care. So they account for about 71% of all time spent in care in South Africa. And this is particularly true of direct care. So this is caring for children and for family members and even for other individuals outside of the household. So for every 1 hour spent in direct care by men, women are spending 4 hours in direct care. Women also account for 81% of direct care and 89% of direct care specifically for household members. So a huge proportion of direct care is being accounted for by women. We can also see that the extent of specialization in particular activities varies by age. We can see this a bit more clearly if we look at gender gaps in terms of time spent in particular activities. And we do this by taking the time that women spend in a particular activity and subtracting it from the time that men spend in that activity across the life cycle. So for South Africa, we get a graph that looks like this. So in this graph, we've taken the three curves that I've shown you previously, and we've just taken the female time and we subtracted the male time from it. So for activities where women are spending more time than men, for example, in care, we will see that there is a positive gap. So the line on the positive side is the care line. Where men are spending more time in an activity, we see a negative gap, and so we can see the market care line, the market work line runs in below the zero. So from this graph, we can see a couple of things. First, men are spending more time in market work than women at almost every age. The gap is particularly large in their 30s, around about 20 hours per week. Women, on the other hand, spend more time at every age in care work than men. So there's always a positive gap, and this gap is particularly large, is at least 15 hours between the ages of 20 and 63. So for a very long period of time, there's a big gap where women are spending much longer hours in care work than men. If we look for the market gender gap, the gap is at least 15 hours for only 15 years of the lifespan. When we add these two together, we will see that in South Africa, women spend at every age more time in productive activities. So this includes market work and care work than men. So they're always spending more time in productive activities. It's important to note also that the time allocated to care work, the amount of time is just one of the issues that women face. Another is that care work is often very time inflexible, so women can't choose when to perform the care activities that they need to perform, and it can therefore constrain the ability of those who perform these activities to seek, to find, and to keep employment in the market. And these are very important challenges that particularly women are facing. We also see the changing nature of the gender gap in education. So in South Africa, what we see is that young girls are spending more time in education than young boys until around the age of 14, but at older ages it reverses. And so we see in the late teens a gap of around about 6 hours per week emerging in favor of boys. And if you think about it in terms of a school day, that's essentially very close to a full school day's worth of time that boys have in education activities more than girls. So our work in South Africa and other countries has been very important in showing us that these gaps emerge they emerge at very young ages and they last through the life cycle. A key concern that relates to gender gaps in time allocations to education relates to human capital accumulation. So children's work activities, whether at home or in the market, may compromise the process of human capital accumulation. In most instances, it's girls and young women who are disproportionately impacted as their care responsibilities erode the time they have available for learning. However, in some contexts, we must also remember that expectations that boys contribute financially to households may see them disproportionately impacted as they enter market work. These gender gaps are very important because they accumulate over children's lifetimes and may result in substantial differences in educational attainment and access to post-secondary education, and consequently lead to large earnings differentials between men and women in the market. For countries that are currently reaping or will soon be reaping the demographic dividend, these gender gaps in education are important in terms of their ability to limit the potential gains from the demographic dividend. And this highlights the fact that apart from issues of equity, addressing gender gaps in care and market work can yield direct economic benefits for both poor and rich countries. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Morne. And I should have said before in the introduction that please, if anyone has a question for any of the presentations, type it into the Q&A box and I'll be channeling those to our presenters. So sorry, I forgot to mention that in the introduction. Morne, I do have one question that I'd like to ask you about your experience with presenting this information in South Africa. So I think one of the things that it shows so clearly is how the gendered economy is sort of a life cycle process that, you know, we sow the seeds of difference very early and they continue on throughout life. And so when you present this in South Africa, what is the reaction? What are people interested in? What does this mean for them? And what kinds of further questions come up for you?
Thanks. So, I mean, I think in South Africa, the big interest obviously is in gender gaps. So the South African government is very aware of issues around gender and disadvantage. I think where people really become interested is where we start talking about demographic dividends or gender dividends. So this idea that, I mean, a lot of African countries, and South Africa is one of them, are sort of banking on demographic dividends to generate huge amounts of growth. And what we have been trying to get across to policymakers and to policy audiences really has been that if we don't address the gender gaps and the disadvantages that women face, particularly in education and care work, that these demographic dividends are not going to be as big as governments are hoping. And so I think it's one useful way of translating evidence that is not, that often people don't necessarily take very seriously in terms of committing funds to or committing energy and resources to addressing, but that they, when you translate it into more economic growth and money terms, they seem to be a little bit more interested in terms of being concerned that it's something that they really do need to address.
That's great. Thank you very much. And now I would like to turn to my colleague Latif Dramani, who is going to tell us about the experience of doing this work in both in Burkina Faso and Senegal. Latif, please.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to present to focus on valuing the domestic work in by using countryman work project methodology in Burkina Faso and Senegal. Then I think that Morne already present the shape for the countries, but I will present the experience for Senegal and Burkina Faso. Then here are the results from Burkina Faso. We in this table we see that there is for young people they consume a lot for other house activities, and for female production also we see that they spend a huge time for producing time at home, and compared to men, they spend 7 to 10 times. Okay, then I will move to for the valuing of household work in Burkina Faso. And you can see here in this table also that the production we estimate the production, we value it at we value the time at general cost. And here, for example, in the case of Burkina Faso, we have 32% of GDP. This is the result for 2018. Then on this 32%, 30% of GDP is the production of time when we value it at general cost. It's very huge. Then when we value the main production at general cost is around 2.3% of GDP. Then we see that there is a big amount of money which we don't which are black in this part of the market, and that's the result for Senegal. The same shape, huge consumption of care for younger people under 5, and we see also that the production of care is big. Time is big for female than men. But this is generally in I think that in all Africa and I think in the world. And when we try to value it, we value it at general cost also. We see that, for example, cooking we take is for 5% of GDP, and the contribution of female is around 3.5% of GDP, and the whole valuing of unpaid households in Senegal is 28% in Senegal, and the female they contribute around 19% of GDP when we value it at share of GDP. Men 9% of GDP, and you see that, for example, care work in Senegal is 11% of GDP, and female contribute for 8% of GDP. And this is the recap for Senegal. When we combine, we see that female they work around 39 hours per week, when male they work only 25 hours per week. The wage comparison is in the local currency is by hour is low, is 3 times low for females than male, and the contribution of national income of this result is that women they contribute to 39% of the income, and male they contribute for 61% of GDP of income. Then for the way forward here is we saw in these two countries that is there is as Morne already showed it, there is a gender gap, generational gender gap between male and female. Then we need in short time to promote gender equity, especially among young people. We have an engagement here for Senegal and to have to elaborate an annual national time use reports. We are help them to do it, and I think that we will report also to all the countrymen work projects to have the experience to share this. And in midterm, we have we need in these countries to promote girl and women schooling and literacy campaign and empower women access to economic resource, and for long term take action to reduce all form of discrimination and gender barriers. That's what I want to show. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Latif. I'd like to follow up with a question about, you said that in short term you're going to begin annual time use surveys in Senegal. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, we have a new data from 2018 time use survey for Senegal and also for all West and Central Africa countries, and they ask to help them produce the reports on.
Okay, that's great. So that means that there's a lot of value seen in this type of data, and so the fact that the governments are willing to finance and carry out this kind of research. So what are they hoping to learn? Is it mainly tracking these gender gaps, or is it part of a broader agenda? Sorry, Latif, you might, if you've muted.
Pardon the interruption, ma'am. Latif has disconnected. Just one moment, I'll reconnect.
Okay. That was bad timing. Unlucky timing. But while we're waiting for Latif to come back on the line, I do think that another thing that his slides showed is the difference. Oh, hi, Latif. Sorry, we lost you for a minute there. I just wanted to ask, with governments supporting the collection of time use data more, what do they hope to get out of it? Are they mainly interested in tracking gender equity issues, or is it part of a broader development agenda? How are they talking about this data with you?
We talk with the Ministry of Gender and Social Affairs here in Senegal, and they are interested to have support on doing the reports, because we don't have now a report on national reports on time use in countrymen work. We don't have it. Then they want to have this, and also they want to have information about results about gender DD, because on AU we have this agenda of demographic dividends and all the ministry work on this. Then now as we have data, then we 1 month ago we have a discussion with them, with the ministry and all the staff at the Ministry of Gender and Social Affairs, to help them do this work. And now we are working with them to have an impact. the impact. We try to have the impact of COVID, and I will interest to the work of I think Colombia, which work on the impact of COVID-19 on the time use. They are interested. They ask us how we can help them to have the impact on gender indicators. Then there is a big demand. There is a big demand now on in Senegal and all the West African countries to have this kind of results and analysis. And that's now the big issue is how to have a community of practice to help these countries, because in this region we have 8 countries, which are all these 8 countries have the same data, which are collected in 2018 and on time use. And I think that this is a big capital for us to try to help them. And
All right. Thank you very much, and I'm glad we were able to get you back after we lost you there for a moment. And with that, I would like to turn it to our next presenter, Professor Piedad Urdinola.
Hello, good morning, and thank you, Gretchen, PRB, and Counting Women's Work for organizing this event. So I will talk today about the differential time use, better education, and gender in Colombia. So just let me talk a little bit about Colombia. Colombia is a developing country in South America, and as many other developing countries, we have issues in the labor market. Half of the workers in Colombia are informal, so that's one thing that you should take into account, and that makes decisions for people different. But not only that, I also believe that men and women have different demographic and labor market patterns, and I do not only believe it, I've seen it in the data. So because of that, they take different decisions on many issues, like consumption or the type of jobs they prefer, and of course in time use. So since men and women are taking all these different decisions at the same time, it has implications on other things, very important things like savings or pensions or how much money to spend on health now that we're under this COVID-19 situation. We have now realized how important it is to spend on healthcare and how much time we devote to domestic labor and paid work. So another important thing in Colombia is that despite being a developing nation, it is advanced in its demographic transition. So since 2010, Colombia has reached a very low fertility rate of 2.1. By 2019, it is already 2.0. So Colombia's fertility is below replacement for a decade at least in Colombia. That means women are having less children, and as expected in many other places in the world, that should release more time of women. However, what we're observing is that women are not devoting as expected time to work or to paid work, and well, that's due to many reasons. But to begin with, Colombia, like in many other countries in the world, has measured these accounts, this counting women work, and we have seen that the housework, unpaid housework, is mostly feminine, while paid work is mostly masculine. So if you look at the first slide here, we have also accounted for education. So on the left pane, you see males, on the right, you see females. We have just left the vertical axis, the hours per week in the same numbers. So you can compare the difference between men and women. So this just showing you how disproportionately female is unpaid housework in Colombia. Is almost everything done by women, very little by men. So women are doing at least 6 times more than men. And we can also see that there are very important differences by education, both for males and females, but it is very striking for females. So women with less education, they do a lot more of unpaid housework, and as they advance in education, they do less for several reasons. First, as you can see in this graph, it delays the start of this housework production, and advancing one more level delays in age a lot more. And once it starts, it will start with lower hours. So in this next slide, I'm showing you here care production. So within housework production, care is what consumes most of the time. So women spend a lot of time producing care. Care means taking care of other persons, children or adults or elderly. In Colombia, the Time Use Survey asks care for any person. It does not discriminate by age. So we have caring for everyone at all ages. And as you can see, it takes most of the time of the women. If you remember the past graph, it reached almost until 35. Here it's the same, only that you see that peak is Q is very much towards the very first ages. Both men and women devote most of the time doing care between the age of 20 and 35. Once and again, we see that as people get more education, they devote less time to caring, but this is true for females, not for males. For males, it changes patterns along the ages. For women, it's pretty clear this pattern. Women that are more educated, they postpone motherhood, and once they postpone motherhood, then they have more time to use in other activities rather than caring. And it's very simple because this pattern of caring is mostly explained by caring for children under the age of 5. So of those 35 hours that you saw in the past graph, 25, as you can see here, are spent in caring for children under 5. So most of the caring is done for children under 5. And then we see again this clear pattern per education. So women who are more educated, they start later in life doing these activities and then spend less time doing these activities. So as I just showed you, childcare is the activity that takes the most time for unpaid housework production and deprive those producers from paid income. We have also seen in our data that once pulled from the labor market, women in their 20s do not come back. So that's a big issue. Less educated women devote disproportionately the most time to caring, and that happens since age 20. That's why we lose them in the paid job market. More educated women postpone childbearing, have less children, and devote less time to caring, yet more than their male counterparts. So expansion of education and formalization of the labor market is a must for Colombia. That will not only help in the labor market, but also in the housework production. There are many policy implications that these findings have, like, for instance, expand childcare supply to less educated women in Colombia, or to promote childcare within or nearby the workplaces by reducing, for instance, labor-related taxes to companies willing to implement policies like these, or in general promote policies that create incentives for men to do more caring activities, such as going to school or take grandparents to the doctor or things like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piedad. I would like to ask sort of a similar question to you as I did to Morne. So what is the reaction in Colombia and other places that you presented this work? I'm so glad that you could join us today to give us the perspective of disaggregating by education. Is there an idea that this is a problem we need to address more for less educated populations, for more educated populations? How are people encountering this research?
Well, the first thing is that it is a surprise for most people, which is surprising for me. So most people are not aware of this issue, so that's the first reaction. That's why it's very important to do events like this, so people learn about it. And second, yes, I think this idea of separating by education or any other socioeconomic variable, if you want, will allow to focus policies, and of course, less educated women are more vulnerable, and we should be focusing in that category. Not that less educated men are not also vulnerable population, but if we're thinking about this problem and we have only so many resources, then we have to do some decisions about it. And yes, it will help doing or trying to improve policies towards that end.
Thank you very much. All right, so thank you very much to my colleagues from the Counting Women's Work project teams. And now I am going to turn the presentation over to Marlene Lee for some different perspectives.
Thank you, Gretchen. We were very pleased to have the Counting Women's Work project here, and we're also very pleased to have Dr. Juan Daniel Oviedo here with us to be able to give us the perspective of someone working in a national government statistics office. And he comes from one of the few countries with a national care economy data collection policy. And they produce gender disaggregated data across sectors include the data on the care economy. He's the Chief Statistician and Director of the National Statistics Office, DANE of Colombia. He was appointed in 2018 by the President of Colombia. His areas of research and teaching include economic regulation, industrial organization, and the economics of networks. He has international experience in consulting for energy markets and government and teaching. His dissertation was entitled Essays on the Regulation of Regional Natural Gas Markets under the direction of Farid Gasmi, and has had great impact in the natural gas industry in Europe. So for those of you interested, you might want to talk to him sometimes about the impact of this work on the transport capacity of the structure of the natural gas industry and the exercise of market power. He has also devoted a lot of time to study of the care economy and has been a professor at the University of Rosario of Bogota since 2005. I'm going to turn the slide management over to Dr. Oviedo and let him proceed. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Gretchen and Marlene, for such interesting introduction. I just wanted to mention that Colombia feels very proud being represented in the team of this institutional scenario by Piedad and Jorge, because we have managed to be close friends here in Colombia, and I'm very proud of sharing this webinar with Piedad and this interesting work that they have presented a few minutes ago. What we want to share with you today is mainly which is the approach that the National Statistics Office is managing in order to cover or to shed some light over gender gaps in Colombia. And more particularly, we would like to insist on the present or the current context of the COVID crisis that we are facing in the global scenario. First of all, we understand that, as Morne said, averages could put some, let's say, ceiling or barrier to understanding very well what's happening as regards to gender gaps in a middle-income country as Colombia. But the situation in Colombia is quite problematic in terms of the allocation of time between, let's say, market activities or paid activities and unpaid or care economy work that is managed inside all the households in Colombia. What you can see in this slide is that, on average, a woman in Colombia works in the load work for every day is around 14 hours, and you can see that there is an equal distribution between paid and unpaid work, 7 and 7. But at the other side, you see that an average man in Colombia works only 12 hours per day, but the allocation is not that equal, and he allocates 9 hours to the market work, let's say, as some other partners have mentioned, and just 3 hours for unpaid work. So here what we have is an issue or a concern that from the public policy perspective and from a statistical perspective puts care economy at the center of interdisciplinary dialogue between the social dimensions of these gaps, but also the cultural dimensions and the productive perspectives of these such unequal situations that we have in care economy in Colombia. As you can see, the gap of unpaid work is approximately 4 hours per day. This places us in very closely to the situation of South Africa that Morne has in a very interesting way shown to us. And the way that we managed to measure that is also a very important issue that we would like to highlight in this presentation, is that in Colombia, not only the institutional framework, but also the legal framework prioritize the show or the demonstration of what's happening with care economy in Colombia, because we have an act that has been enacted in 2010 that mandates to the National Statistics Office to produce or to perform time use surveys every 3 years. For example, I'm sure that Piedad used the first generation of our time use survey, and right now we have the second generation, which is the time use survey that has been performed between 2016 and 2017, and finally we are about, if the COVID crisis allows us, hopefully we are about to start our third generation of time use surveys for the period 2020 and 2021. This gap, this problematic gap from the public policy perspective, and following the advice of Morne and some other examples also in Senegal, concentrates in some dimensions when we say social, cultural, and productive. Let's talk about the social dimension, and let's talk about time poverty in Colombia that we are able to measure thanks to these important time use surveys that we performed in 2016. As you might see, the gap, the more important gap that we have as regards to time poverty between men and women is in the time or the age interval between 30 years and 45 years old population. That means that at the moment that women and men are highly productive in their economic life, it's when we face the larger gap between, as regards to time poverty between men and women. As you can read the table, 40.6% of women that are aged between 30 and 45 years face time poverty. So they do not have enough time to perform the allocation that is developed by this measure, which is very important because it puts us at the topic that the gender gaps in Colombia could not be understood just only from the social perspective, but also from the productivity perspective. Because as you might see, when we are concentrated between employed population, we see that when women are employed in the labor market or in the market economy, the time poverty that they face amounts to 54.5% of population of women employed in the labor market. And this is something that puts us at the social dimension. But when we go to the cultural dimension, this is something that is very concerning. When we, in the last generation, the second generation of our time use surveys, we were interested in developing some measures about perceptions or sexist perceptions in Colombia. And for example, when you see one of these sentences, we hope that we managed to translate it well. When women and men were faced with the sentence that says that a man's duty is to earn money, a woman's duty is to take care of the home and family, you can see that both women and men agreed to this perception in the same way. And for example, when you see that the head of the home must be the man, also about 40% of women insisted that they asserted to the sentence in Colombia. So we also have a cultural root of these gender gaps in Colombia as regards us that women and men both coincide sometimes in the existence or the pre-existence or predetermination of these gender gaps, which is something that has to be solved by the educational system in our country. And that's why in Colombia, thanks to the fact that we have an institutional and legal framework that puts at the same level the productive dimension, the cultural perspective, and the social arena, let's say, of the gender gaps in Colombia, we as a National Statistics Office, we are committed to developing several specialized publications and developing pedagogical tools in order to allow statistics to put some light in public policy, how public policy is going to develop in Colombia, a care economy system and a care economy policy that could allow the Colombian economic system to take advantage of this huge gap that we have in care economy between men and women. And we are faced to an important challenge to say, how are we going to develop a general equilibrium model that could allow us to show how the Colombian economic system, as regards of productivity or economic wealth or social inequality dimensions, could be changed if, for example, we reduce in just 1 hour the time gap that we face in care economy. So these platforms that we are trying to develop insists on some specialized publications, and for every time use survey, we have a compendium and a huge document that shows all the statistics that we can grasp from the time use survey, but also we are developing some continuous statistical production that could give some starting role to this care economy policy in Colombia. And this leads us to showing some special features of the labor. For example, as when we take into account that one of the main impacts of the COVID-19 crisis is going to be represented in a recession or a stagnation of economic growth. As you might see in Colombia, when we put together the unemployment rate gap at the time series between 29 and 2019, what you can see is an U-shaped gap that has a minimum level under which, under the moment that the Colombian economy was growing faster in the recent 10 years. So what you might see is that, for example, in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, that is going to be like of the expectations of economic stagnations that we are going to face in the following year. You are going to see that the unemployment rate gap between women and men is going to increase. And the responsibility that we have as a National Statistics Office is to put this information at the public policy level in order to see how are we going to avoid repeating such a terrible situation that under economic crisis we are going to face an increase of the unemployment rate gap between women and men. At the other side, for example, we managed to follow closely the very interesting approach of South Africa, that we are trying to have an intersectional approach of what's happening between these labor market gaps, between age intervals, and at the same time we are putting something which is very, very, very challenging for National Statistics Office and from the public policy perspective, is that the composition of inactive population from the labor market framework. In Colombia, the inactive population, when we try to see the inactive population, what we are going to see is that the large part of inactive population is citizens which are dedicated to care economy or unpaid household work, and the relationship between men and women of this inactive population share is, for example, 1 to 10. If we have 5.5 million population in an inactive situation in the unpaid economy or the care economy, we see that about 5 million population is women and just 500,000 population are men. So we have a tremendous gap in care economy in Colombia that probably is generating problems in the productivity perspective that we want to put into evidence in this kind of statistics that we are producing. And getting close to the COVID crisis, Colombia, as it happens in, I could advance in around the world, the health occupations or the health sector is managed essentially by women labor force. For example, in Colombia, when you want to see what's happening in the health and social services activities, you see that around 77% of the labor force corresponds to women. And when you go to the educational sector, you see that 63% of the feminized economic activities correspond to women labor force. On the other hand, you see the main activities that are going to be affected by the economic crisis that is going to come forward after the COVID pandemic, you see that in Colombia, around 64% of occupied women correspond to the wholesale and retail activities and the touristic activities, let's say the hospitality sector, and to the health and social services. That the current literature of the OECD and the United Nations says that are going to be the most affected activities in the economic perspective. So this, wrapping up all these ideas, what we want to see is that Colombia is seeing a very important opportunity in this crisis. I want to be very, I know that we are concerned that this is a problematic situation, but we see it as a strategic opportunity to put or to increase the priority level of the care economy system in Colombia, because right now, when we are in a lockdown and the confinement measures, we are seeing gender violence that is increasing in our country, and we are seeing, and now families are seeing how hard it is to play a role inside the household and to be responsible at the care economy activities. So we have several some other slides that we want to share with you in the presentation that is going to be posted in this platform. But we wanted to close very fast with some opportunities and challenges that we see as a National Statistics Office with the care economy and the time use surveys. We see that right now it's very important, and I'm convinced that we cannot see as National Statistics Office time use surveys just as a tool to measure the share of care economy under GDP. We have to disentangle all the social, cultural, and economic dimensions that we can see from time use surveys, and we consider it as a strategic tool in order to put some strategic platforms for transformational approaches of the labor market in our countries. And on the other side, we see that the time use surveys and the care economy perspective from the statistical scenario could be a road that we could pave in order to introduce interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary dialogues as regards to statistical production. We believe that statisticians, we cannot be just cheap statisticians anymore. We can, or we have to become data stewards that could manage statistical production in order to show which are the most important gaps or the main problems that society has to face in the forthcoming future. This is the main message that we wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oviedo. I have a few questions that are clarification questions, I think, from the audience. There are a couple of people who asked about the differences by household composition in terms of the care economy. And then there's another question that asks whether if the fertility rate in Colombia declines to 0, will the differences between men and women for unpaid activities disappear? I will let you answer those.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Let's go to the first one. And we had a slide here that a colleague of mine is also at the conference, which is Karen Garcia, and I want to thank her a lot for helping me to understand that. Here we have this slide, and when we qualify Colombian dwellings or Colombian households regarding if they are a biparental or single parent, and what we can see is that the fact of the composition of the household or of the dwelling goes closely to the time gaps or the time use gaps or gender gaps that we see in care economy. For example, in Colombia, we have that 40% of Colombian households are headed by women. And this is a statistic that we managed to produce thanks to the Housing and Population Census of 2018 that I also want to highlight because I'm very proud that Piedad was a referee of this population census in order to evaluate the quality of the information that was grasped in this population and housing census. But when you go to the households or the dwellings that are headed by women, you see that 46 or let's say 47% of such households which are headed by women are single parents. So in such a scenario, the main responsibility of care economy is in the head of the women and the single women, which is the head of the household. So in Colombia, when we it's very important to put some context to this answer. When we were showing the results of the population census, people were very happy because the female heading of households increased like 10 percentage points between 2005 and 2018. But and some people started to say, oh, this is the main illustration of economic empowerment of women. But when you see that such households, for example, let's say in the aggregate composition of households in Colombia, 16% of such households are headed by single women, the gap that you are going to face in time use is going to be very large. And this is some illustration that could put some light to the answer that was asked with this question. And the other it's decreasing in a very fast way. That's something amazing. Let's say, as an anticipation, we are obtaining a fertility rate in Colombia from the population census of 2018 of 1.9, which is quite low as regards of the 2.5 that we obtained in the population census of 2005. But the problem is that even having a recent time use survey, which is the time use survey between 1916 and 1917, we are facing such gaps, and we are facing such gaps as regards of care work, inactive population in the labor market. We cannot see that the reduction of the fertility rate could be an inertial cause, let's say, to closing the gaps between unpaid work in Colombia. And that's why we are convinced that as a National Statistics Office, those numbers are going to be very important to show that based from the productive, cultural, and social dimensions, taking into account and putting as an example for some other countries that we have an institutional and legal framework that prioritize care economy in the public policy perspective. Thank you.
Okay, one last question for Dr. Oviedo before we open to the entire panel for questions. One of our viewers asked, they understand it's not a great gap in ideas among men and women in Colombia, that both are equally capable of paid work and family support, but there's a big gap in thoughts on how to best provide care. Are the normative surveys that explore that gap? Are there surveys that ask if women and men are equally capable of paid work to support families? And ask, should they be both equally capable and responsible for care?
Okay. Let me understand that very well in order to have a sound answer. But yeah, there is not a. Let's put it. And I'm going to be irresponsible, and let's say that we can find that there is a consensus in Colombia that women is more efficient in unpaid household or domestic work in Colombia than men. And this, let's say, this kind of consensus is a perception or a cultural perception that make the gender gap inherited from the beginning. Because if a girl is developing in a household under which the social norms and the soft abilities are going to be biased to do some cleaning and to do some care work for their younger siblings, you could say that's going to be to introduce the gap during all the development stage of those girls, and this is going to bias the decision of the educational bias the professional perspective. That's why we believe in Colombia that the gender gap that we face as a society has to be faced or has to be managed also from the educational system in order not to predetermine that women are more efficient than men as regards of cleaning houses, or that women are less effective in math or in science than men in Colombia. That's why we are trying to insist that when we see the gender gap in the labor market and we see the gender gap in the political institutions, we have to go under the head of the iceberg. We have to see that there are social norms that are inducing or fostering the existence of that gap in Colombia.
Thank you very much. I'm
Sorry.
sorry.
No, I
ahead.
just wanted to close up saying that that's why, as a National Statistics Office, and following the example of the OECD countries, we are moving towards subjective well-being measures. So we are moving towards a situation under which perceptions are also important from the statistical perspective in order to show those dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure there's a lot more we could learn from you, but I'd like to involve some of the other presenters in some final question and answer here. I have some questions for Dr. Urdinola. Professor Urdinola, I want to ask about time deficits and time poverty by education. What about leisure time for more educated women? Do they have more leisure time than less educated women and then more educated men? And then also, we talked about the time spent caring for children with respect to education, but does the extra money also mean that educated women can afford help to care for children, not just that they have fewer children?
Well, Marlene, with respect to your first question about leisure, it's just the reverse. Men have more time for leisure. More educated men have the most. Less educated men have the least among men. And then among women is the same. Least educated women have the least time for leisure. Most educated women have the most time for leisure. But when you contrast men and women, men have a lot more time for leisure than women. So it's this time that women dedicate to unpaid housework is basically what men are using for leisure. And the more educated you are, disregarding men or women, the more time you have for leisure, and that's probably connected to your second question, and it's just the ability to buy time. How do you buy time? By paying to others or buying things that do the housework for you. So more educated women have enough money to buy laundry machines, to buy, pay for school care or for daycare or a nanny or someone to help you with your kids. So it's just this relationship and this availability of both things or people who can help you that you can afford when you have more education. And it's also this idea of postponing childbearing and having less children as well. More educated women have less children than less educated women or men. And that's just the same. So the combination of these factors is what leads to those results.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience members for Dr. Dramani. And it's, I believe, Dr. Dramani who raised the question of developing a community of practice for measuring and assessing unpaid care work and domestic work. What are key barriers to, I believe, to having the community of practice? And then are there key barriers to country-level data collection? Dr. Dramani, if you could answer briefly.
Okay. Thank you, Marlene. The key barriers here is knowledge transmission. We don't have specialists on the field. I think that that's the big barriers. it's important. It will be important to have a capacity building for scholars and in Senegal, for example. And I think Senegal is the same in the region, West Africa region, to help them doing this analysis, time use analysis. That's the first thing. And the second is to try to have some reports or instruments which are very easy for people to understand. I think that if we have these two tools, we have the training for scholars and also for policymakers. I think we can have this community of practice in Senegal and in the region.
Thank you. Dr. Donehower, could you just talk a little bit about the app that's on the Counting Women's Work website? And do you have time deficit and poverty by gender for each country on the app?
Thank you, Marlene. So I put the web link to both the project website, where you can access the data from the project, most of which has been publicly released. And there's also there a link to an online app we have that's basically a data explorer. And we have paid work, unpaid care work of the two different types there, and time spent in education. And we also have the consumption of time too, so not just who is producing the time, but also who's consuming it. So we do not have a time poverty measure there, but I think that is definitely a direction that we as a project should go in thinking about what Dr. Oviedo said about the subjective well-being measures that are becoming more prevalent and that are important for all of us to kind of coalesce around a group of indicators that for the next round of data production and visualization that we should definitely add time deficit indicators.
Thank you. Dr. Oosthuizen, I just wondered if you could, you focused on South Africa. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about time poverty in South Africa. And also, I know you've worked on this type of analysis for other countries in East and Southern Africa. Could you tell us some of the countries that have recent data?
Sure. So we actually haven't done a huge amount in terms of time poverty. What we do know in South Africa is that there are big differences in terms of women and girls spending a lot more time in productive work. And I think it's the same as Piedad was saying, that really what comes, where the cost is paid is really on the leisure time. So I would imagine that if we had to look at it, we would certainly find greater time poverty amongst women than amongst men. In terms of other countries, so I've done some work. The big issue is really that there's not very much data. So we've managed to work on the two South African surveys from 2000 and 2010, but then we've also worked on Mauritius, which has a 2003 time use module. So it's obviously quite old, but there the gender gap is huge. So women are spending huge amounts of time in the house, in the home, and men are really dominating in market work. So there's a much stronger gender specialization in Mauritius than we observe in South Africa, and South Africa's already got quite substantial gender specialization. But we do know of a couple other surveys in the region. So we know that there's one in Tanzania, which is also quite old, but we haven't been able to access that data. But I think the big issue with doing this work is that the time use surveys are really they're really quite rare, and my sense is that they're not high on the priority list. So we do struggle for data.
Thank you very much for broadening our scope a little bit here. And we're short on time, so I wanted to ask one last question of Dr. Oviedo, and that's really if you could tell us a little bit about the simulator of unpaid domestic and care work for home and community, and what could young women or school-age girls in Colombia learn from this data?
Marlene, I think he might have had to leave. He had an emergency call, so I'm afraid that he had to go. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. Gretchen, since we have you on the line, any last closing thoughts that you'd like to offer us?
Thank you. I think one of the things that I am most curious about, I mean, certainly there are the technical matters of getting data and doing the estimates and putting them out in a way that is understandable and compelling for people and leads to sort of decisions that affect policy. So there's sort of those kind of hard issues. But one thing that I wish that it was possible to measure, but it's just not, is this idea of sort of soft power or soft change, that one of the things that we accomplish by having conversations like these and producing the data we do is raising awareness, is increasing the visibility of this type of work, is including unpaid care work in conversations around work when most of the time it's ignored. So I think while certainly we want all sorts of targets about policy changes and things like that, I think we do also have to recognize that one of the things that we can contribute is just simply continuing the conversation, raising these issues, is sort of opening the door to the household. And that, I think, is becoming even more salient in the era of pandemic, and everyone is either working at their essential jobs more than ever before, and very crucially, or is at home. And so the role, the life of the household, the role of the household is becoming ever more visible and ever more important. So I hope that this conversation and this work can continue along in that vein, sort of creating that soft power around care work.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all our speakers. I think, as Gretchen said, especially in these times, it has become very clear the importance of the household and women's roles in the household put them at risk during this crisis period. We will continue the conversation by answering unanswered questions from the audience in the next couple of days. We'll get some answers out to you. And I want you all to know that the speaker slides are available for download, and the webcast recording will become available shortly. So thank you very much for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.